This podcast is created for farmers and powered by Pioneer Agronomy to bring you agronomic insights and proven solutions to fuel forward-thinking farming.
Hello and welcome to the Indiana Pioneer Agronomy Podcast. I'm agronomist Brian Schrader on the eastern side of the state, Indiana. And today I don't have my co-hosts with me. Those guys are busy, and so thought we would do a recording today, do a podcast with a special guest. And so my guest today is Keith Schrader, my father from Blackford County. And so we thought we'd talk a little bit about Dad's history in farming, his history with Pioneer, talk a little bit about the crop and some of those things, but just get an opportunity to talk with Dad a little bit about what he sees now, as he's been away from the farm field as an active farmer for a few years, but always still curious and a farmer at heart. And so with that, Dad, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Brian.
So I thought maybe the best place to start would be, let's just start with a little bit of history for folks so they can get to know you. A lifelong Blackford County, Indiana resident. I know that you started your farming career, I guess, officially when you graduated high school in 1965 and farmed for many years with my grandfather and your brother, Gary. And then a handful of years ago, basically retired and have leased out the farm. But maybe talk a little bit about just your early history with agriculture and with farming and getting started farming, maybe a little bit of the history of our family and how we all farmed and just those kind of things.
Well, your grandpa, my dad, farmed all his life, and there was nothing that I thought I wanted to do any more than either fly an airplane, drive a truck, or farm. And it was simpler to farm than do any of the other above. So I have farmed as long as I can remember. Dad started me driving the tractor when I was about 7 years old. We had a real bad year weather-wise, and the corn went down terrible bad. And they had an old 2M picker on an F20 and missed a lot of corn. And Dad spent a lot of days picking corn up into piles in this one particular cornfield. And he put me on the Ford tractor with a little trailer, and I'd go around to the corn piles and we'd pick them up. Then we'd drive to the next one, we'd pick it up. And that's how I got started driving a tractor. And when I was about 9 or 10, they turned me loose on the hay rake. It was my job to keep the hay raked, and then I drove to the baler. That was actually the start of my farming, but we've always had cattle or hogs or chickens or something around to look after.
Well, one of the stories that you've told off and on growing up that I think is interesting is talk a little bit about the decision in 1965. I know you were looking at buying a particular car and then decided not to buy the car because of a conversation that you had with Grandpa Schrader and ended up with a tractor. Maybe talk a little bit about that story. I think that's really illustrative of how Grandpa Schrader thought, but then how you realized that you wanted to get into farming in a serious way.
In 1965, in April, I believe it was, the senior class, industrial arts class, took a trip to the Rouge assembly plant in Dearborn, Michigan for Ford. And they built Mustangs at that time. And I fell in love with the 64 Mustang, 65. When we come home sometime after that, getting ready to put in the 65 crop, I was bound determined I was going to have a new 65 Mustang. And I talked to Dad about it, and Dad says, are you going to buy a car or are you going to farm? So I went and bought an M Farmall.
Okay.
That's how it started.
Did you buy the Farmall from Craig Baum's in Montpelier, or where did you buy that tractor at?
I'm trying to think now where it did come from. I think it did come from Craig Baum's, but they were in Marion at that time.
Okay, they'd moved from Montpelier to Marion.
They'd never in Montpelier.
Oh, they were never in Montpelier.
Hartford City.
Hartford City, okay.
Yeah.
All right. So what do you remember about that first spring that you were farming with Grandpa? So that would have been the spring of 65, or would that have been 66 after you graduated?
No, it was 65.
Okay.
I had some rented ground at
Okay.
65.
Okay.
But of course I'd farmed all my life.
Right.
I've always helped Grandpa, or Dad. But yeah, it was 65 was the first year. And you wanted to make ends meet. So you wanted to make more than you put into the crop.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think about that story. I remember you talking about that growing up and how, at least for me, that stuck in there, that knowing Grandpa how I did, I can imagine what that conversation was like about, well, are you going to drive a car? Or are you going to farm?
Exactly.
I can hear him saying that.
So I bought an M.
So you bought the M. Yeah. So in that first crop, I mean, you'd been farming your whole life, helping Grandpa, and then the rest of the family, obviously, we know that Grandpa had a couple brothers. And at that point, I guess Uncle Herschel had passed away 10 years or so earlier or so. And then, you helped Uncle John, and different time then where you help neighbors compared to today. I mean, it still goes on, especially when there's things that happen in communities. But in those days, it was kind of everybody in the community helped everybody else. Do you remember what the year was like in 65, the weather or anything that year for crops?
I remember it was a good year. Like you said, I was kind of a third arm to Dad. And at that time, if somebody needed help, Dad sent me to help. And Bob Goodspeed, brother, got burnt. And Bob and his brother Kenny had a couple milk trucks. And they were trying to get the milk all hauled. And Bob had crops to take care of. And Dad sent me over to help Bob. And I helped. Oh, I think I put on some 28 and did a little bit of cultivating for him that fall. And then Bob put me in one of the milk trucks before I was ever old enough to have a chauffeur's license by 3 months.
Yeah.
So then I hauled milk for Bob part-time while Kenny was getting better after the time he spent.
Yeah.
So I was working for the neighbors or helping the neighbors out, working at home too.
Yeah. Okay. So in 1969, you meet Mom, right?
Yep.
And so you're married in 70.
In 70.
Yeah.
Yep.
And so I know that, like, the house where we grew up hadn't really been lived in much. You guys had to do that. We put that all together. How did that
house
go?
had never had a bathroom in it or had running water. And Dad and a neighbor worked on it while I was in school, and we got that all together. That was in 65. Then Mom and I moved in there in October of 1970.
How did you convince Mom to move into a house like that didn't have any of that stuff in it?
She didn't care. She wanted with me.
Okay. Fair enough. Well, another, I guess, kind of point that happened was Grandpa had his heart attack in 70,
69.
late 69, and then 70. So
no, I'll take that back. It was September of 70.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
before we got
married in October. And
That's
so
right.
obviously in that time period, living through the kind of heart attack that Grandpa Schrader had was pretty surprising, and it took a real toll on him. So I guess in 70, you were in charge, I guess you could say. What did that look like? I mean, you were making decisions. Was Grandpa still involved in making those decisions, or did he just kind of say, you need to handle it? What did that look like?
Both. He told me I need to look after things, and he still went ahead and told me what he thought I ought to do. And Gary had started school or was going to school at Taylor University, and he laid out a semester to help me harvest. And we still pretty well done all the harvesting, and Uncle John helped when he could, but he had his own to do too.
Yeah. So it's a Pioneer podcast, and our farm has always been at least partially Pioneer.
Correct.
All those years. I know that you planted Pioneer when you were, getting started. And there's some pictures floating around of me as a little kid with Pioneer hats on and things like that.
We were put in contact with John
Larison, not Anson, Larison.
That was in Amboy.
Amboy, yeah.
And we were going to become a Pioneer dealer at that time.
Okay.
And then John had health issues.
Okay.
It was transferred to somebody else, and we never sold for John, but we bought seed off of John.
Okay. So it was Larison. So you were just
John Larison.
You were just hauling seed from John's place in Amboy home.
Yeah, right.
You weren't hauling for other folks.
No. We hauled seed beans.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I know that when we talk about Pioneer hybrids, one of the hybrids that you talk about a lot is 3780.
Oh, correct.
And so, that in that day, 3780 was kind of an early hybrid for this part of the world, even then.
But it was good corn.
Well,
it stayed right there, had a good girthy ear. And when you had a good field of corn, you drive down beside it, all you saw was a straight line of ears right straight down the line from end to end. I've always liked 3780.
So what kind of population were you guys planting 3780 at in the time?
Well, at that time, it was about 18 to 21,000.
Okay.
And I remember when we finally went to 24 to 26, but at that time, it was a determinate ear size.
Sure.
So there's a lot of genetic changes in the product, and 3780 was no more. There was two numbers we planned after. Was it a 3915, 3914?
Could have been. I don't know. That
something like that was trying to replace 3780.
Yeah.
And numbers over the years have changed so much, I've never kept up with them.
Yeah. Well, 3780, interesting thing, we're going to celebrate Pioneer's 100th anniversary in 2026. And one of the things that you will likely see, that you'll see is we're hoping to do what we're referring to as legacy plots at some different demo sites across the country. And it'll have key products from the history of Pioneer that'll get planted. And we've done it out in Johnston for a number of years in those demos that are across from the Carver Center there at Johnston. And we're going to try to bring those out at more local for folks to see.
3780.
And I don't know. I haven't seen the
That'd be
list.
great.
I haven't seen the list yet to see what those products will be, but it'll be interesting to see if.
Well, you could drive around East Central Indiana, any place, and see 3780 signs along the road.
Yeah.
In that time.
Sure. Absolutely. Yeah. It's a pretty fondly regarded product, at least in the Eastern Corn Belt. I talk about it with a lot of folks who, are more seasoned that have been around.
They still remember.
And a lot of people remember 3780. There's key products in Pioneer's history that folks remember. You go back a little bit further than that. There's some of the old 3-digit double cross stuff that folks still think about. And 3780, 3394 obviously gets a lot of
3394 and 95. Those were the two other hybrids.
And 3394, that was a big product for Pioneer for, years. Anybody that's listened to the podcast, we've, talked about it a handful of times on the podcast. We've got a product now, 1742 Power Core, that its win percentage nationally is as high as what 3394 was. And it's funny to see the reaction when I mentioned that at field days, how some of the guys perk up, because it's been a long time since you've seen a product in the business, in the industry that has that kind of
that
record, that does that well. So that's pretty fun to be able to talk about. So, well, you and I talk a lot about farming on a pretty regular basis when we talk. You talk about planting at 18, 20,000. You look at all of the other advancements that have happened in farming and agriculture overall, since you started farming in call it the mid 60s if you want to. What are two or three things that you see or you think about that were big changes that made a difference not only in your farm, but when you just look at the way farming changed over those years that you were actively doing it, what are 2 or 3 things that come to mind for you that really impacted how you did business or what the business looks like today?
Well, it's much more complex than it was to me. With the price of machinery and the price of all inputs as far as that goes, compared to what it used to be, we could go buy a new 4020 for $7,000, and a new tractor today's $300,000-400,000. Of course, there's a lot of difference in horsepower and what they get done and what they've done, but that seems to be a challenge, is to make ends meet nowadays. $1 million combines.
Yeah.
And we bought a brand new 82 Massey Ferguson in 64, I believe it was. And that combine was $6,200.
Yeah.
But it didn't have all the goodies on it.
Yeah. No XM radio or air conditioning or
No
any of that
GPS.
stuff. No GPS, no guidance. Yeah. AB line was pointing to the other end of the field.
Yeah.
Yeah. What else? I know that you have always been a student of soybeans. I mean, I think it's interesting that, I grew up around you my whole entire life. And then it wasn't until I think I was actually at Purdue that I found out that you had this interest in being a soybean breeder and had even been accepted to Purdue at one point. And then just because of circumstances didn't end up going. But I mean, you've always been a pretty astute observer of soybeans. Talk a little bit about soybeans and, things you've seen change, or your thoughts on soybeans today compared to what they were.
Well, back when we first grew up, hair soy was a big one. It was an early bean. It potted right down on top of the ground, and the headers that they had in those days wouldn't allow you to cut any lower than about 4 inches. And with the hair soy, it was potted clear to the ground. And I always thought there ought to be, and there was a lot of good varieties of beans after hair soys. That wasn't the only one, but that pod needed to be brought up off the ground a little bit. The plant needed to be taller. The plant needed to be bushy, so that when you was planting, and at that time we were in 38-inch rows. We didn't know what solid seeded beans were, or no-till. No-till come along after we started farming. And we planted as bushy of a bean as we could when we went 30-inch rows. We were on a ridges for a while, which I still think's an ideal way to farm, but you've got to cultivate. A lot of people don't like that.
Yeah.
But when we got the 12-row cultivators, that was fun.
Yeah.
You could we had a Henniker 12-row no-till cultivator with the big single sweep in the back. And it was fun to cultivate 12 rows at a time. And you could run across the field 5-6 miles an hour. And I hated to cultivate with the little Jubilee Ford tractor and a 2-row cultivator. That was my starting out cultivator tractor. Dad got the 4-row on the 88 Oliver, and I cultivated with Ford. And but when we had that 12-row Henniker, that was fun to cultivate through that ridge back up.
Yeah, the thing I remember about that set of Henniker cultivators, they had lift assist wheels on it. The thing just weighed a metric ton. It was really heavy. I remember even occasionally we'd try to move it around the barn lot with one of the smaller tractors, and even then that was not very good. That was a challenge. So you brought up the ridges, and I was a young guy when you guys started that and threw up the first set of ridges, I think in either the fall of 79 or the spring of 80, maybe, was when we started with the ridges. Does that sound right?
I think it was a little after that.
Okay.
That was close.
What made you guys look at ridge till and decide to make that jump? Because there were a handful of folks in the community doing that. I can think of a couple folks that were doing it. We were Buffalo folks, and one of the other guys in the community was a Buffalo guy, but then there was another fellow that Norman Reed was the Buffalo guy. And then Ted Klein was the Henniker.
Ted had a Henniker.
He had Henniker.
We had Buffalo.
Yeah. What made you guys go to?
In the first place, the main reason why we went that direction, some of our ground's marginally drained. We got high clay soils.
Yeah.
And we thought if we could get that ridge up and let that ground, it will warm up. And there's no doubt about it. It will warm up and dry out quicker than the flat, no-tilled soil. And in the spring, you shear off the top of that ridge and plant your ground or your seed in that soil. And the ground was always warmer than it was between the ridge. Of course, the sun was always shining on top of that ridge. And it kind of kept some of the seed out of the water when we get heavy rains. And it worked out well. We were able to fertilize in the ridge, and not necessarily, we did broadcast fertilizer, but we also put some fertilizer in the ridge.
Sure.
And we tried putting 28 on with regular fertilizer, but it just better to knife it in later.
Yeah.
We used a lot of anhydrous, but then we went to 28 because it was easier to work, and you didn't have to worry about turning the ground up between the ridges.
Well, and when we did the 28, I know we put 28 on with the cultivators.
Yeah, we did.
At the end. And I mean, that, even as a young guy, I remember thinking that was probably the way to do it. But like you mentioned earlier, just size operations and things like that, cultivating today is pretty difficult. And, these high-speed 28 applicators, just trying to cultivate, and you guys were using saddle tanks. So you had, 500 gallon of 28 at a time. Yeah. That doesn't go very far in a big, huge cornfield.
Well, the ridges are similar to strip till today.
Right. Yeah.
Clean that 4-inch area out. You don't have any debris on it except maybe where the water washes across through the wind. It dries out quicker if you don't have any, well, can't think of the word I'm trying to use right now, but it was clear. It's clean.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. I think the Achilles heel for ridge till was twofold. One, you've got to be, it's equipment intensive. I mean, you got to have the cultivators, you got to change shovels, you got to move the sweeps around, you got to do all that stuff. And you got to have tractors. Nobody wanted to cultivate.
That was only on the Buffalo,
Right.
Henniker. You didn't have to do that.
But you had to do that. And then I
The
think
disc killers, you turned them around
to throw
pull the dirt away from the ridge.
and
then later on, when you went to lay the corn by, you threw the ridge back up.
Yeah. I think the Achilles heel for ridge till, honestly, was the soybeans. At the time, soybean breeding, it went to more inline stuff compared to what you were talking about with the bush, and you were on 30-inch rows. And I would say that you guys always did a really nice job of raising a corn crop, probably average or above for the part of the world that we were in. But soybeans suffered because at the time, I know even in Pioneer's day, we had a lot of short inline beans, and in 30-inch rows, they just didn't work. And that was kind of where the industry was at the time.
Well, one year we rented a drill and tried to sow beans on the ridges, which did fine. They grew fine. They looked good and all. But when you go to harvest, you couldn't get those beans between the ridges. So you had a lot of loss that way.
Yeah.
So eventually we went away from the ridges so we could no-till beans.
Well, and I
called seeded beans.
I remember, we used cyclo planters for years, and then we got the last international planter. I guess we used the Buffalo corn planter for a while.
Well,
that was plates, back in those days. But we tried that, demoed a 15-inch row planter that International built, or Case IH built, that had the cyclo units underneath it, and it was under essentially a grain drill box, thinking maybe 15s was the way to go, rather than trying to do a solid seeded. I don't know that we got any better luck with that when you still had the same challenges in between the row, I think, as I remember.
Now, we had a 900 Case International planter that we took a cultivator. Let's see, how did we do that? No, I'll take that back. We had a white planter that we put the cyclo units pull
in between.
Yes.
Yeah, made our own 15.
And we made our own 15s. That's
Yeah.
what we did.
That was as we kind of were starting to move away from
Yeah.
the ridges, though.
Then we bought the first no-till drill.
Yeah, yeah. Got the tie drill, and
Got
then
the
I think
tie.
at that point we had the Kinsey planter too, didn't we?
No,
That was still
no. We were still using a conventional corn planter to plant with.
Okay. Yeah.
Then we did eventually buy the 12-row Kinsey planter and bought a Great Plains drill.
Yeah, that's right. After the tie, that's right. I'd forgotten about the Great Plains
Yeah.
drill. Yeah.
We used the Great Plains a great deal. And
Yeah.
then we had a 5100 international grain drill that we sawed seeded beans with, and we traded it and the other one on the Kinsey planter.
Yeah.
And then we had that, the Great Plains drill.
Yeah. What, as you kind of take a step back and you look at everything that's going on today, one of the things, obviously, we know that commodity prices are not great at the moment.
No, they're not.
And, one of the things as I thought about this visiting with you today was, you were farming in the 80s when it was not rosy and
No.
interest rates were, double digits, and all those kind of things. You guys obviously made it through that. And when I say you guys, you and Uncle Gary at that point, in the 80s, it was really you and Uncle Gary that were farming together.
Mhm.
Grandpa was still involved, for advice and things like that. But I mean, essentially at that point, he'd became almost like a landlord, I guess you would say. If you had advice for some of these folks that are farming today that perhaps aren't old enough to have lived through that and seen that in the 80s, what advice would you give to folks about trying to, I guess, weather this storm?
Well, I don't know, honestly. You can't farm with old machinery. You've got to have new machinery. The land prices are high. It just takes a lot of input. You got to make sure you're going to make enough to cover your costs. And as far as advice, I wouldn't want to give anybody advice nowadays.
Yeah.
Really.
Yeah.
It's your own situation that you got to look out for, and you got to make sure you keep your head above water.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
But these commodity prices are terrible right now. Now, I don't know of a good way I'd like to see things get good enough that a guy didn't have to take subsidies, but I don't think that'll ever happen.
Yeah.
Don't think that'll ever happen.
Yeah. That's a good point. I think about all of this and, from a personal perspective as the agronomist for Pioneer, I never go out there and tell somebody to do something that I don't think is a good idea. One of the things I always think about is if I'm in a farm, if you were farming still and I'm in the field with you, how would I tell you to manage it? That's just kind of the philosophy that I have. How would I tell you or somebody that I know well, that I've grown up around, how to make those decisions? Because, it is incredibly tight and trying to.
Well, I see more micromanaging nowadays. And by that, I mean, everybody needs to take soil tests. We always took soil tests, and we always tried to go by what was recommended to us to get the most bang for our buck. But there's so many people now playing around with micronutrients, and a lot of it I don't understand. Some of these chemicals, I think boron is a good deal, and some other things, but can you stand the expense? I definitely think nowadays we know that the times are changing. Our weather is so much different than it used to be. I think weather's probably the number one thing, more so than fertilization.
Yeah.
To be honest about it.
And the thing with weather, the folks on the podcast know that I'm kind of our resident weather nerd.
Mm-hmm.
And,
You got that from me.
yeah. And you can't, you don't have to talk about, global warming or
No.
any of that doesn't matter. What we do know, though, is to your point that the weather is far more extreme now
Oh, it is.
than it ever has been. I think that the breeders, corn and soybean breeders, are somewhat taking that into account. I don't know that they're purposely doing it, but because they're developing new products under those kind of environments, they're obviously going to reflect that extreme weather. I mean, even just in the last handful of years, if you look at the amount of rain that we get, it doesn't change that much from the average. But what we find is it's less often, but more intense. You talk about all the time, years ago that getting a 3-inch rain was pretty uncommon. And now when it rains, it either doesn't rain at all or it rains almost.
Well, should we think about raising cotton and peanuts in this part of the world?
I don't think,
You know what I mean?
yeah, I don't think we're there yet at all. That's a interesting thing. There's a lot of folks that
It's
look
been
at
years we thought
alternate
we should have been
crops.
raising rice.
right. Yeah. There's folks that look at alternate crops. To that point, I guess I'm curious, one of the things that is different that, not too far from where you live, there's folks that, are working and trying to make cover crops part of their program.
Yep.
That's kind of a return. We're trying to get the benefits of a 3 or 4 crop rotation into a 2 crop system by putting those cover crops in. Do you have any thoughts or anything to share about cover crops at all?
Well, we used to put a lot of sweet clover in the oats, in the wheat. If we knew we weren't going to make hay out of it, we wanted to put alfalfa or clover or something in it. And we plowed down that sweet clover. Now you don't plow,
Yeah,
And the sweet clover would get rank enough, it'd be hard to spray with Roundup and kill it off
sure.
like some of the other crops. But I've never been against a green manure crop.
Yeah.
Never.
Yeah. I think the thing with cover crop is there's several different thoughts on cover crop. We've talked about it on the podcast before, in our part of the world, like you talked about with poor drainage, let's call it, Blounce and Palamos that are 0 to 3% slope and those kind of things. One of the things that you got to think about is erosion control. I mean, that was one of the things that as a kid with us being on ridge till, I remember the old T by 2000 thing where you were trying to get to that T number for, erosion control. And I remember, stringing yard or rulers or tape measures out and counting residue, what percentage of residue you had. I remember us doing that a handful of times and trying to understand that. And so, there's a school of thought on cover crops that it's about erosion control. That's one school of thought. And then you've got another school of thought where it's about, holding on to nutrients and recycling them and putting, deep tap root stuff in the ground so that it can bring, fertility from down. I mean, you think about all this kind of stuff over the years, it's been tried, folks that raised fish worms and then you put additional worms in your soil to try to help with drainage and those kind of things. So it's all over the gamut. Some of those things come back around usually. But I don't know, just you've seen a fair amount and have always been a pretty keen observer of those kind of things. So I was just curious, your thoughts on that necessarily. So as we kind of get to the end of the time here, Dad, I guess a couple things I'd be curious about. What are you excited about when you drive around the countryside or you talk to folks that are farming or are farming your ground now or whatever? What are a handful of the things that in the next handful of years you're excited about for agriculture or for farming in general?
Big machinery.
Okay.
I love machinery. I love machines. I don't know. I think the economics of the big thing is what I'm concerned with more than anything else.
Sure.
And there again, it goes back to weather. What's weather going to be like in 5 years?
Yeah.
What's it going to be in 10 years?
Yeah.
We've seen a big change in weather in the last 10 years.
Yeah.
Well,
and I think the weather piece, like I say, because we're developing products under the weather that we've got right now, it does take that into account. But you look at some of the other practices that are being done. I spend a lot of time every summer looking at disease, northern
Sure.
cornleaf blight, gray leaf spot, tar spot. Now this year we had a lot
Red
of
crown coming
red
on.
crown coming on in soybeans, but this year
Insects. I mean,
southern rust got to be a
yeah,
big deal.
I don't think that we have the insect problem that we used to have.
Yeah, well, and I think some of that
You see more
yeah.
than I do by being in the field all the time,
Yeah.
but we used to have invasions of army worms.
Yeah,
Haven't seen army worms in years.
Yeah.
I'm sure they're around.
yeah,
But one year, aphids was a real bad problem.
Right.
We sprayed for aphids.
yeah,
Several fields. I think we sprayed more than once
yeah.
because of aphids.
Yeah, I remember one year when, to your point, spider mites were super
Real bad.
real
Real bad.
we don't typically see that quite as much. I mean, there are places that did. I kind of expected that we might have seen some spider mite damage on some soybeans because we got as dry as we did here in the last month or so. But realistically, I haven't really seen them. I mean, maybe a few around a post here or there coming out of a waterway, but nothing to the point where
Right.
anybody would need to
Right.
spray. But, there again, all the environment, whether it's the insects or the disease or things like that, 2025 has been interesting just because the weather has been so up and down. It would get incredibly hot, obviously, and that had an impact on how fast our corn crop grew, but then it would cool down, then it would get hot again. And I think part of the reason why we don't, some of the disease, at least around, was not as bad as we expected, was we never really got a sustained weather pattern that was conducive to that. Northern ended up being a little bit worse in some spots than what I thought it was ever going to be. We've been at it just almost 40 minutes, Dad. Anything else before we kind of let everybody go that you want to talk about or you want to mention?
Yeah, the only thing I would like to see is some changes in some of the weed killers that we do have. There's a lot of weed pressure. Excuse me. Excuse me. Mare's tail, water hemp, glyphosate won't kill it off anymore, doesn't it seem like?
Yeah.
There's, excuse me, weed pressure that maybe needs to be changed. Maybe
Yeah.
breed something else into.
We're certainly working on that. You've got the Enlist soybeans with Enlist herbicide that it helps with that. Obviously, that we're using pretty heavily now, but you've got other companies that are looking at other things. We're looking, and Corteva and Pioneer, we're looking at some of the next generation of herbicide tolerance so that we can try to stay ahead of it. The big thing, I think, if I look at it, even in my career in the industry, for a lot of years, the only thing we relied on was Roundup. We just sprayed Roundup over the top once we got, into glyphosate tolerant beans. And that's all we did. We never really talked about putting in multiple modes of action. And I think the big thing is, and I think the lesson to be learned from that we're trying to use with Enlist is to make sure that you're not just spraying Enlist and glyphosate, that we're putting residual products in, different modes of action, different classes of chemistry to try to extend the life of the technology as long as we can.
Like back there in the 60s, most everybody used atrazine on their corn, and we had Amabin and Lasso for the beans. And the number of chemicals available to us were very few compared to what they are today.
Yep. Yeah, for sure. Yep. I mean, atrazine still is a huge part of our corn program, and rightfully so. It should be. It still works well. So, yeah. Well, Dad, thank you for doing this today. I've certainly enjoyed it. I learned some things that I didn't necessarily know, or at least clarified some things as well. So appreciate you taking the time to sit down with us and
thanks for
podcast listeners. Yeah, you're welcome. So with that, I appreciate Dad joining us for the podcast. Hopefully some of his insights and thoughts have been helpful to you. Maybe a little bit of a different type of podcast than what we would normally do, but wanted to get this down and wanted to be able to visit with Dad a little bit. I've been meaning to do it for a while, and just things finally worked out for us to do that. So as always, if something on the podcast got you interested and you want to reach out, please reach out to me. You can always reach out to me at brian.schrader@pioneer.com, or you can find me on Instagram at B_K_Schrader. Hope that this finds all of you well. Hope that as harvest gets started here in the next few days and weeks, that you're safe. And please continue to follow along with us this fall as we continue to record podcasts. And so with that, thank you for joining us for the Indiana Pioneer Agronomy Podcast.
Thank you for listening to this episode from the Pioneer Agronomy team. Be sure to visit pioneer.com/podcasts to access additional episodes and learn more about our extensive on-farm data and innovative digital tools that are fueling forward-thinking farming.